Warning: the film discussed in this video contains graphic scenes of rape, child abuse, bestiality, and intense violence and gore. If you find such content offensive or frightening, please proceed with caution. Originally, I was going to do a Studio Ghibli film for this episode, but the comments section of my review of Ratatouille drew my attention to something else. Something lurking in the shadows that I had never heard of. It is the infamous animated horror anthology, Where the Dead Go to Die. This interesting creation is commonly deemed one of the worst animated films ever made. It's often criticized for its shocking and rather extreme material, some suggesting that it's merely a sequence of disturbing events with no point or story. So the big question here is whether there's any sort of merit to be found in this amalgam of nightmarish imagery and sensitive topics. We won't find out by beating around the bush, so let's begin. Let's first discuss the animation itself. You'll notice right away that this doesn't look like a professional 3D animated film. One of the biggest giveaways is some of the environments, such as with these really blocky looking houses and sometimes barren looking outdoor settings. Some of the models look either excessively low poly, sloppily textured, or both. On a few occasions you'll even see images or footage with a black box around it. This black box is where the alpha channel of the image is, in other words, where the image would be transparent. My first guess as to why this happened was something went wrong during the rendering process. However, some of the environments look much better, such as the interior of this church and this particular outdoor scene. Then there's the character models, which actually look okay for the most part. Modeling decent-looking human characters isn't an easy task. They almost have this sort of comic book style look to them, which was a better call than trying to make them look photoreal. Animation-wise, however, they tend to waver between decent-looking movement and really fake-looking movement. In some sequences, there's proper easing on the characters' motions so that they look more natural. Other times they'll move in a rather linear or robotic fashion, such as instances of characters gliding across the ground or looking stiff as a board when they shouldn't be. It's also worth noting that the characters have a wide range of expressions on account of having complete facial rigging, which is utilized well and helps offset the sometimes awkward body animation. When talking about the visual quality of this film, there's something else that ought to be noted. Professional 3D feature films have teams of people working on each part of the production pipeline. Teams for modeling, teams for animation, rigging, texturing, and so on. In this case, just about the entire pipeline fell on the shoulders of the film's creator, Jimmy Screamerclouse. Almost every other name in the credits is attributed to voice work. Seriously, if you're making a really polished 3D piece for a portfolio or demo reel by yourself, 3 to 5 minutes is considered a long runtime. This film is 95 minutes long. So although the animation has numerous issues, it's commendable that Mr. Screamerclouse put in the time and effort to animate an entire film alone. Now let's get into the writing and more interesting visuals of this film. Where the Dead Go to Die is split up into 3 chapters following 3 different characters, so I'm going to analyze each chapter one at a time. The first in line is called Tainted Milk. It surrounds a boy named Tommy, who has a troubled home life on account of his quarreling parents, who gets talked into thinking his unborn brother is the Antichrist by a demonic dog named Labby. Character-wise, they're all pretty one-dimensional. Tommy is a kid who we know and learn almost nothing about, Tommy's mom is stressed out, and Tommy's dad acts like, well, an ass.
Well, son, a condom is a little piece of rubber that comes in a package that prevents any and all pleasure derived from sexual intercourse.
As for Labby, he's less of a character and more of an archetypal demon that resembles the devil. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it doesn't work in this story for reasons I'll get to in a moment. Another issue I have is the pacing of this story. Right from the get-go, we witness Tommy's parents get into a heated argument. Then immediately after, Labby appears to tell him his unborn brother is the Antichrist. They dump so much of this dark material on you at once that it just comes off as silly and heavy-handed. There's no real build-up to the disturbing scenes that happen later. It's more like a constant stream of gloom, fire, and brimstone. Speaking of which, the first really gruesome scene in the film happens when Tommy returns home to get rid of the supposed demon inside his mother.
Do it, Tommy. Do it for God.
So, right after telling Tommy to kill his unborn brother, Labby goes right ahead and does it himself. Why? At the beginning, Labby was set up as the kind of satanic figure who coerces people into committing evil acts. Him murdering Tommy's parents not only undermines that setup, but also makes it look ridiculous when he tries to deflect the blame later.
I'm only a messenger. You can't blame the messenger.
I should mention that while writing this review, I heard rumors that this film was intended as a comedy. Keyword being rumors. I've only heard this through hearsay without any sort of verification. I bring this up because this first chapter is the only one that has anything resembling comedy. Even then, considering the sitcom-esque opening of this chapter, it leads me to think that comedy elements may have been inserted into this chapter to try and make it more disturbing rather than funny. But if that was the case, it still doesn't work. These somewhat comedic moments really stick out and clash with the overall tone of the scenes they're in, making them feel unintentionally stupid. Honestly, when I first saw this scene, one of the first things that went through my head was, why isn't the husband waking up despite his wife screaming bloody murder right next to him? He doesn't even budge until Labby bites his penis, leading to the two dumbest lines in the entire film.
What the fuck? Are you some sort of faggot cannibal? Oh, you're eating my dick! Was that my brother?
Quickly, take his hands and cut yourself with his fingernails so it looks like he attacked you first.
Fortunately, the rest of the dialogue in this film isn't anywhere near that bad. After the bloodbath, we finally get to the interesting part when Tommy passes out. Here we're treated to a bizarre nightmare sequence that's really a lovely change of pace. Like a number of the other freaky sequences that pop up in this film, it has a very Silent Hill-esque feel to it. There's also a lot of interesting camera work and editing tricks here, keeping the sequence feeling fresh. Although, the tilting zoom they have going on is used a little too often throughout the film, so it gets stale by the second chapter. A couple things I particularly like is this bizarre room Tommy walks into. He sees a clone of himself in the fetal position floating in a suspended container, as well as a hypnotic ceiling. It appears that this is supposed to represent Labby's control over him and the helplessness he feels as a result of it.
I'm afraid of him. I don't know what to do.
However, this imagery would have had some weight to it if Tommy had actually carried out the murder himself under Labby's insistence. Then there's the Shadow People. I really like this creature's design. The use of live-action footage for the eye gives it an uncanny feel, and we only ever get a glimpse of what they really look like under their shadowy exterior, making them that much more mysterious. Once the nightmare sequence is over, Tommy goes to talk with the lady in the well, a creature who apparently opposes Labby. Reason I bring this scene up is because it makes matters confusing later. Then we meet these two.
He's the keeper of man's ears and the creator of his woes.
What does this weird character and Mr. Sunhead have to do with this chapter? I honestly don't have a clue. This is the only time they appear in this chapter and don't seem to have any effect on the story. Then Labby shows back up and tells Tommy that he can bring his parents back to life if Tommy sacrifices his virginity. Meaning that Tommy has sex with Labby. You know, this isn't all that shocking after seeing this dog forcibly rip a woman's fetus out of her vagina and then castrate her husband before ripping his throat out. How is this necessary? It certainly doesn't add anything to the narrative, it just feels tacked on to try and be extra edgy. Out of the 3 chapters, Tainted Milk feels the most like violent and disturbing imagery with no real point. Most of the story is spent on Labby rambling about God and breast milk, Tommy witnessing Labby murder his parents, and Tommy passing out and having a nightmare. Even if a story is short, there needs to be some level of character development for it to be effective. In this case, there's practically none. The next chapter is called Liquid Memories. To start with the positives, this one has a rather interesting concept. It's about a junkie addicted to a special fluid that the human brain releases upon death, which when injected can be used to edit one's own memories. It's also better with tone and atmosphere than Tainted Milk, such as with this sequence when an injured prostitute shows up at the junkie's hideout begging for help.
My eye! He took my eye out! I don't feel right, please.
It really feels gloomy and tense as we're left anticipating what the junkie will do. Also, unlike Tainted Milk, the main characters are a little more rounded. We actually learn about these characters through their memories, so they don't feel entirely flat. Then there's the wild, surreal visuals we see all throughout the second half of this chapter. It's a roller coaster of bizarre creatures and dreamscapes formed out of the memories of the two main characters. The plot of this chapter, however, quickly becomes very hard to follow. Basically, this junkie kills a prostitute who was looking for help after being attacked by an unstable war veteran, harvests her memories under the insistence of the Shadow People, then gets lost in her memories. Much of the story here is difficult to decipher since the memories are so jumbled and warped. It would have helped if we were given a clearer idea of what these memories were about before they turned into crazy nightmares. It's also unclear as to what the role of the Shadow People is in this story. Are they real demons or hallucinations brought on by the memory injections? Something else that bugs me about this chapter is this guy's bouts of monologuing. In the beginning it wasn't so bad, as he was just setting up the situation, but later on, it's as though the story feels the need to wedge in a big chunk of exposition here and there to make sure the audience is up to speed. Ironically, this makes matters even more confusing at times when it explains something that should have been clear in the first place.
The memory splits itself into two different halves, one representing the old string of memories and one representing the new. I did it. I converted a horrible memory into something positive.
Was that his goal? I thought it was to eliminate his memories of death. Plus, it's unclear as to when he's just passing through the memories and when he's actually altering them. Matters get even more confusing when Labby shows up in the memory stream and starts messing with the junkie. I really don't understand why. Long story short, this chapter left me with a lot more questions than answers. If this guy killed himself in the church, how did he leave to meet Tommy? Did he become a ghost or some kind of demon? What was the point of him changing one of his and one of the prostitute's memories? Also, who is this girl that just shows up at the end? While this chapter is really intriguing to look at, the story is unnecessarily convoluted and comes off a little pretentious at times.
She knows that your testicles are filled with the tears of God, and she can use her holes to make him cry.
Moments like this make it sound like there's more to this story than meets the eye, but there's nothing here that actually gives it relevance or backs it up. To add even more confusion to the chronology, we get this random scene that picks up where Tainted Milk ended. I don't know why, since it doesn't actually go anywhere. The last we see of Tommy here is him sitting at a payphone with some unknown voice on the other end of the line. From there it's on to the final chapter, The Masks That the Monsters Wear. This is undoubtedly the most well-done chapter out of the three. I have to warn you, however, that this also presents the darkest and most disturbing story. Essentially, it's about a boy named Ralph, who has a dead Siamese twin attached to his face, who becomes infatuated with a girl named Sofia, who lives across the street from him. At first it doesn't seem too dark, but then we learn that Sofia's father runs a child pornography ring and forces her to star in his productions. Okay, I have to say right off the bat that this story is not pure shock value. During my first time watching this, there were a couple spots where I expected it to go into full-on shock mode for no reason. But it surprised me by not only sticking to the story, but also doing more with character development, tone, foreshadowing, reincorporation, and by having something of a point to it. Something that really stood out to me in this chapter over the other two was the lighting and cinematography. There's not only a wide variety of shots that lend themselves well to the storytelling, but also plenty of moody and colorful lighting that helps amplify the tone of the scenes. It also helps bring out what the characters are feeling, such as during this emotional scene after Ralph ultimately betrays Sofia. She's lit up with red and blue light bleeding into each other, resembling the mixture of anger and sadness boiling inside of her. One of my favorite shots in particular comes towards the end, where one of Sofia's father's clients suddenly gets shot, and then we see a silhouette of Ralph's brother. It's one of those cinematic shots that really stuck with me. Then there are these silhouetted shots of Ralph's parents in the doorway to his brother's room. What's interesting about these is their correlation to the shadow people, as during the story Ralph becomes more and more afraid of his parents and consumed by darkness. Also, unlike the other two chapters, where a lot of the imagery was either hollow or just plain confusing, this chapter contains symbolism and themes that actually fit into the story. For example, the title refers to more than one kind of mask. There are the literal masks involved in the story, like the ski mask Ralph wears to hide his face, and then there's the figurative masks, like Sofia's father posing as a normal guy when he's really an abusive monster. This chapter also has some religious imagery, which doesn't feel out of place since Ralph lives with parents who err on the religious side. This also gives Labby's rambling about God here some weight, as it feels like some kind of story Ralph might have heard about or imagined due to his upbringing.
You know what happens when you lose your soul? The animals start to reject you.
Now let's talk characters. Ralph is the most well-developed character in the film. He is a quiet, lonely, and good-hearted boy that wants nothing more than to be loved. He suffers from seizures and hallucinations due to his dead twin brother, whose brain occasionally kicks on for a few minutes. There's also a darker side to him. Ralph carries fear and resentment of his parents, who seem to care more about his stillborn brother than him, and who also repress him sexually. Then there's his attraction to Sofia, which escalates to obsession as he becomes desperate to make sure she loves him. There's a steady progression from him being an innocent child to him being consumed by his desires and rage. Even though he makes some terrible decisions, he's confused and conflicted about what he ends up doing, which makes the final outcome of his story all the more tragic. Additionally, the roles of Labby and the Lady in the Well feel more substantial in this story, especially if you think about them as voices in Ralph's head. The Lady in the Well serves as Ralph's conscience, an entity that speaks the truth and wants to guide him down the right path. On the other hand, Labby serves as an embodiment of Ralph's selfish desires and his growing animosity towards his family, a wicked voice that leads him astray and tells him what he wants to believe. Oh, and this guy shows up again too.
Who are you?
The one who can hear you.
This cloaked character should have only been a part of this story. Why? It seems that this character is meant to suggest what Ralph would grow up to become as a result of these events, and in terms of this chapter alone, you would think that he was another of Ralph's hallucinations. This reveal isn't completely out of nowhere either, as you can see that this cloaked character and Ralph both have the same two-colored eyes. Then we have Sofia. She's a sweet girl who likes gardening and shares Ralph's liking of bugs. While she hates having to take part in her father's sick business, she was brought up to obey his every command and believe that anything that goes wrong is her fault.
Sorry, Daddy.
Oh, sorry. You're sorry. Now, sorry does not pay the motherfucking bills.
This causes her to have a strong sense of self-hatred that becomes evident towards the end, as she explains to Ralph how she had been taken advantage of her entire life. Sofia has just the right amount of development for this story. She doesn't feel totally static or flat, and it shows how Ralph's feelings towards her were those of obsession rather than love. Love isn't something that blossoms within a week of meeting somebody that you don't know much about. Ralph's parents and Sofia's father aren't as developed either, but they too have enough development to serve the story. As previously mentioned, Sofia's father acts like a regular guy on the surface, but is an abusive monster behind closed doors. It's suggested that he has a rather messed up past during one scene where he monologues to Sofia.
I seen him back when I was little. Back when I was little, girls like you used to tease me, but used to show me things that I could never have.
Kinda makes me wonder what exactly happened to make him this way. As for Ralph's parents, they at first just seem strict rather than abusive. Ralph's mother in particular is stricken with grief over losing one of her children to stillbirth, in addition to being left infertile after Ralph's birth. She and her husband don't cope well with the loss, as they try to carry on as though Ralph's brother was alive. The big difference between them is that the mother expresses her grief through sadness, while the father tends to be more aggressive and angry. The latter is taken to the extreme later when he nearly strangles Ralph in a fit of anger. The ultimate clincher with Ralph's dad is that it turns out that he once took part in one of Sofia's father's movies.
I know how it is. I've fucked her before.
Was this something just thrown in to pile on the disturbing? Well, no. It's foreshadowed earlier in the story when he catches Ralph masturbating to one of the videos he got from Sofia's father, reprimands him for masturbating, but makes no mention of the actual video. Plus, the scene of this reveal serves as the final straw that pushes Ralph over the edge. Speaking of foreshadowing, let's talk about the actual story. The plot is relatively solid and well-paced. It doesn't waste any time setting up the overall theme, as it begins with Ralph watching a children's show depicting an abusive relationship. It's also used to foreshadow the conflicts that would come later.
Sometimes people do things to you that feel good, but are actually bad.
The real world and Ralph's hallucinations are clearly distinct from one another as well, so the jumping between worlds doesn't feel confusing like it did in Liquid Memories. A stark contrast between this and the other two chapters is that this one has more of a balance between the really dark stuff and some calmer, more normal scenes used for character development. The best example of this is when Ralph and Sofia spend a day playing together, sharing each other's interests, having conversations, and watching the beautiful night sky. There are some points in the story I think could have been expanded on more, such as Ralph's interest in drawing and his experiences at school. Both of these are glanced over once and never mentioned again, even though they could have easily been reincorporated. For instance, have a scene of Ralph drawing numerous pictures of him and Sofia as he becomes obsessed with her. Or have scenes of them interacting in school in a way that helps develop their relationship and Ralph's subsequent obsession. Like she's the only one who treats him like a person while the rest of the kids either ignore him or tease him. However, the overall plotline isn't without its gaffes. Some of these are more minor nitpicks. For instance, when Sofia's father first offers Ralph one of his films for $50, Ralph just so happened to have that cash on hand. Then there's the more major ones, which mainly consist of moments where this chapter crosses over with the other two.
But I'm afraid of him. I don't know what to do.
Like in Liquid Memories, moments like this make the overall chronology of the film really confusing, and I was just left wondering why all these stories were even happening at the same time. At one point, we even see one of the shots from the end of Liquid Memories, which apparently doesn't happen until later in this same chapter. Now, before I get into the overall point of this story, there's one particular scene I want to discuss. One that will haunt me for years to come. In a desperate effort to ensure Sofia loves him, Ralph goes to her house and volunteers to star in one of her father's films with her.
It's okay. I promise you everything's okay.
For me, hands down, this was the most disturbing scene in the film. It presents a mortifying contrast between this horrifying act and the beautiful day Ralph and Sofia spent together. It also serves as a critical turning point in the story. Ralph had to decide whether he would succumb to his selfish desire or listen to Sofia and leave. His decision marks the point of no return for his relationship with her, meaning that he's undone any and all trust and respect she placed in him.
Use your magic touch to comfort her.
Why isn't she enjoying it? What am I doing wrong?
You're doing nothing wrong.
That brings me to the underlying message here. It's not as simple as rape is bad or domestic violence is bad. Although, the story does unflinchingly depict these things as thoroughly disturbing and life-shattering. The latter is especially evidenced by a chilling final line we get from Sofia.
I can't even feel the pain anymore. You saved me from him.
So, what's the message here? Part of it is the importance of communication in relationships, be they familial or otherwise. Throughout the whole story, Ralph doesn't really have anyone to confide in. He doesn't have any close friends, and he's emotionally neglected by his only family. The only ones he really ends up talking to are the voices in his head. With all his anger and anxieties bottled up and turned inward, It ultimately results in him snapping and going on a murderous rampage. This story could have turned out so much differently had Ralph been able to talk with someone responsible and trustworthy, rather than ending up alone to take matters into his own hands. This applies to Sofia as well. She constantly undergoes extensive physical and emotional abuse, and she has no one to turn to for help. It's likely that even if she did, such as if she felt comfortable enough confiding in Ralph, she would be too afraid to out of fear of her father retaliating. This ends up leading to her own breaking point, which she describes as going numb. The other part of the message is the destruction that's wrought by teaching boys that it's okay for them to sexually take advantage of women. In the beginning, Ralph is a naive boy with no sexual experience. Sofia's father exploits that naivete by deceiving him into thinking that if the girl is crying and begging you to stop, it's all part of the act and it's okay to keep going.
She was pretending she was crying because you weren't the one fucking her.
Additionally, at one point Ralph's father is revealed to be homophobic.
It's not just your cock you're jerking off, it's also your brother's, and I refuse to have a faggot for a son.
This is significant because it could have played into Ralph's decision to rape Sofia, as in doing so would prove himself straight and earn his father's approval. Actually, that's exactly what happens.
Sofia's dad dropped this off a little while ago. I'm proud of you, son.
Of course, all of this doesn't excuse Ralph's decisions, but it does explain how he reached them. It's not like he doesn't suffer any consequences for his actions either. He loses his only friend, his home, his self-respect, and it's even suggested that he loses his soul. The final shot of him with the cloaked figure suggests that he would grow up to be a mad, solitary zealot, and Lord knows what would become of the irreparably broken Sofia. All things considered, I can't call this a good film, but it's not one of the worst I've ever seen either. Just because this film contains disturbing material and sensitive subjects doesn't automatically make it an irredeemable atrocity. It's a horror film, it's dark and disturbing by design. There was creativity and a lot of effort put into this, especially evidenced by the fact that almost every facet of it was done by one person who most likely couldn't afford a full animation team. That's already a lot more than I can say about the last 3D animation I reviewed. I was really fascinated by the surreal imagery and compelled by the third chapter, the only one that actually feels like a coherent story with some kind of point to it. What brings the film down the most for me is the rest of the storytelling. The first chapter just comes off like a bad creepypasta trying really hard to be edgy, and the second chapter has an interesting premise that falls victim to a muddled and confusing plot. None of these chapters actually blend together, so all the connections trying to be made between them feel forced. If Screamer Claus just focused on the last story and fleshed it out more, this film would have been much better. This isn't his only feature-length endeavor either, as in 2015 he released his next cinematic outing, When Blackbirds Fly. I don't know anything about it, but I'm curious to see how it turned out compared to this heavily flawed but passionately made film. And that concludes this episode of Animate Ball. Thanks for watching! If you'd like to stay up to date with all things Animate Ball, click that little red button beneath the video that says subscribe. Feel free to discuss the animation in the comments, but please try to keep it civil. It makes the experience better for everyone. If you know of any interesting or more obscure animated works that you think would be worth discussing, don't hesitate to suggest any. Next time on Animate Ball.